If I was going to pick one supplement, one extra thing for a menopausal woman, peri-post, as something that you should be on for the rest of your life, it would be creatine.
There's nothing to suggest that creatine is at all potentially damaging to liver or kidney function at all.
There's probably really nothing that interferes with creatine. It can be taken in a gel, a lozenge. You can get it through your diet and meat.
I saw a lot of literature around the benefits of creatine on Parkinson's disease, and I went down this rabbit hole, and that's when I was really putting out content saying that, hey guys, creatine isn't just for the neck down, which is the body, and for physical performance, it's also for brain performance.
D3 creatine is the way of the future, and it's a way to directly measure skeletal muscle mass.
And that was the one supplement that had nothing but positive benefits associated with it. There was literally nothing she could find that correlated creatine with anything bad in the body, side effect wise, nothing.
You've inspired me to stay consistent with creatine, so I'll be on that.
I know that we have some shared supplements that we enjoy. When you're talking to your female subjects or talking on podcasts or publicly, what are some of your favorites that you think for women in perimenopause and menopause can be most beneficial?
Creatine for one. So good nod of the head there. Yeah. Creatine is the good one for all of us. So important because one, for women who are eating less and or following vegetarian, vegan type diet, don't get enough creatine anyway. And we also have less stores than men. We also see that creatine is so important for the fast energetics of our body. So we're talking about gut health, heart health, but in particular, brain and brain metabolism. So we really want to push creatine for health. And we also can see a benefit for muscle performance. It's only 3 to 5 grams. It's not a lot. And when we start seeing women who start using creatine, not only do they mentally feel better, they're also seeing better muscle performance. It takes about 3 weeks to fully saturate, though. So it's not something that you just take a one-off before training. It's something that you actually want to take on a daily basis. The second one that's really important is omega-3 fatty acids, especially in perimenopause. For cellular integrity, we're having more oxidative stress. We need to really protect our cells. And so omega-3 fatty acids, super important. And the third one I often talk about is vitamin D, because we see such a precedence of low vitamin D intake and low vitamin D levels. We have a lot of the slip, slap, slop in the sun, right? So we have a hat and sunscreen and a shirt. So we aren't getting that sun exposure. We're also looking at a lot of time inside, and the ultra processed foods aren't doing any good. So we're looking, if you need to supplement, then a vitamin D3, but also thinking about how mushrooms are your friend, because mushrooms are really good sources of vitamin D. So those are the 3 big ones that I talk about for the most.
There's a big difference. Without essential amino acids, you die. Without creatine, we can still survive because we can make them. So essential amino acids are found from food products or supplements because we can't produce those in near the quantity that we're needed to basically keep our body alive. Enzymes, hormones, bone, muscle, everything we need. So protein is an essential macronutrient. Some people like to call creatine conditionally essential, but keep in mind, creatine is basically formed from indispensable or essential amino acids and non-essential. So we're naturally producing it in the body like a lot of our proteins. However, unlike essential amino acids, which are required to keep you alive, essentially, I think that the little bit we produce in our brain and kidneys can keep most people very healthy and functionally as well. So that's an excellent question. I'm glad it was essential amino acids versus individual amino acids. There's a huge difference. Essential amino acids are very important. They can improve a lot of beneficial things with muscle growth, whereas the branched chain may be a little limiting, at least with the essential. And I know there's a big EAA-9 new template coming out, which is great for individuals to look at food products that have a lot of these essential amino acids. So there's a huge difference between a creatine and the critically important essential amino acids. Yeah.
No, thank you for that, because I feel like that question, in light of branched chain amino acids, the essential amino acids, and trying to make sense of what supplementation is really most important. I think that's the crux of the conversation, is that a lot of people feel a sense of overwhelm, and they're hearing different information from different individuals, and they're trying to determine what for me is most important.
And when I cut out supplementation, like if I'm, on a trip or something for a few days and I don't bring creatine supplement with, I noticed it so much more than really any other supplement that I've ever taken. So that's why I was so curious about it, because, I'm definitely always in the camp of like, I would like to get everything I can from whole foods. I'd like to try to cut out as much supplementation as possible. But that one seems like the one where, if performance goals are kind of, up there on your hierarchy of goals, it just makes a lot of sense to add it in, it seems like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Another common question was, and this made me laugh, not because there weren't many people that asked this question, but I was like, it's consistent with other things that we talk about in the body. Since our body naturally makes creatine, will taking exogenous creatine halt my body's own production of it? Might seem silly. And this was Tracy's question.
Oh, it's certainly not silly. That was the biggest thing when EAS, the pioneering supplement company, came out. The theory was that, well, if we naturally produce it, just take, for example, insulin. If you synthetically inject insulin when your pancreas doesn't need it, there is some theory that it could downregulate that. And that was happening in professional bodybuilders. So the theory was, well, if you're taking a supplement you're naturally producing, maybe the body says, whoa, I'm going to rest and take it in. There was a single study done in mice. It was actually a rodent model, and it was shown to downregulate its natural production. But as soon as they stopped taking the super physiological dose, it came back. We're not aware of any good evidence in humans. I guess the theory would be the liver is going to be making it, the brain is going to be making it. Anything additional, which is nice for the human body, will accumulate in the tissues. We now know it's not just muscle, and any extra could be dumped down the toilet in the form of creatinine. So we're not aware of any good data in humans that it does downregulate the natural production.
It's really interesting, because I know even with the use of melatonin can be controversial. People say, well, you make less of it north of 40, but if you take some of it as you're making less of it, is that problematic? So I think that's certainly a reasonable question.
Yes.
Does creatine lead to an increase in body fat? This was Kelly's question. Again, a question that was asked many, many times.
Yeah. So we just published the second meta-analysis last week, looking at adults 49 and younger. So if you look at adults 18 to above, when they combine it with resistance training, we saw no increase in body fat across any population. We actually saw a small decrease in percent body fat. It was significant, but it was less than about 1%. So collectively, you should probably conclude that creatine does not increase fat mass. It's probably going to have a minimal, trivial effect if you're really going through the weeds. The whole theory here is that if you take creatine where it is osmotic, some individuals experience acute water retention, or maybe the number on the scale may go up. That's probably based on the dose and the length of time you're taking it. And if it is a water fluctuation or distribution, a lot of people feel like, hey, I'm a little bit heavier or a little bit more bloated, maybe on the loading phase. But we're not seeing any evidence that increases fat mass. If anything, it may have a beneficial effect on whole body energy expenditure.
Yeah, it's interesting. Both my teenagers take creatine, and my youngest son, who's put on quite a bit of muscle in the past year, I mean, he is so conscientious, and he actually listened to the podcast we did together, and now is taking 10 grams a day because, for him, he was like, I like this brain element. I like knowing that a little more will cross the blood-brain barrier. And he attends a pretty intense school. So for him, he's like, it's helping my brain and my muscles. And so that for him, that is definitely something that he thinks about quite a bit.
Right.
How about, I know that we had talked last time that creatine and caffeinated beverages don't meld well together. Now, is there anything that we should not take creatine with at the same time? I know caffeinated beverages. Is there anything else, any other liquids or foods that you should not take it concurrently with that may impact or lessen its ability to be as efficacious?
Yeah, it's a hot topic. So let's start with the first one to sort of clarify, I think, even for some of your viewers around the caffeine, because a lot of people immediately say coffee, caffeine, it's the same, and not really. So the studies that have looked at the interference with caffeine have typically done pills or powders, and some have done solution. However, the dose is usually around at least 250 milligrams of caffeine. So if you think of a normal cup of coffee is about 80, that's about 3 cups, okay? And that's usually done with a higher dose of creatine. So there's only been about 7 studies, and there's good mechanistic data to suggest that those two metabolites sort of interfere with one another. There's probably really nothing that interferes with creatine. It could be taken in a gel, a lozenge. You can get it through your diet and meat. At the end of the day, it might delay the absorption or getting into the bloodstream. Solution is superior to meat, lozenge, candy, whatever. That will peak in the blood the quickest. I think that's why a lot of people will just put their creatine in water or fruit juice, whichever. But the only thing we see an interference effect is high dose caffeine for longer periods of time.
That's funny. I'm sure you guys talked about this on the last podcast, but every single pre-workout is like 250 plus. Like that is like the number too, is 200 to 300 milligrams of caffeine. So I'm sure maybe
there isn't an interference effect. I got a lot of questions today, and I said, if it's working for you, just keep it. There's cellular data to suggest they oppose one another. But the other thing, to your point about those pre-workouts, there's usually creatine and caffeine, and then there's 9 other things: beetroot juice, leucine, beta-alanine, sodium bicarb. So you never know what's working. But at the end of the day, I tell people, if you feel like it's working, then why stop, really, unless it's going to hurt you. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I was laughing and saying one of the big takeaways from our last conversation was everyone was then paranoid to put the creatine in their coffee. And now reassuringly knowing that, 1 cup of coffee is not going to offset the benefits. But if you're having 20 ounces of coffee at one point, all at once, then that might be the case. How about, do you feel that there's a certain amount of water that needs to be consumed while taking creatine? One listener said, I heard that it was a gallon or more a day in order to ensure that you stay hydrated while taking creatine. This was Paige's question.
Yeah. So the theory here is we don't know the exact amount, but it's certainly advantageous to consume more water, ideally to help maintain the plasma or decrease the viscosity of the blood. So if the blood gets thicker, it has more hematocrit or cells in it. So it sort of could potentially fluctuate blood pressure or heart rate. But I always recommend to drink about 2 or 3 more glasses of water a day. That helps maintain the hydration, not only of the muscle, but also the plasma or bloodstream. Because hopefully if individuals are taking creatine, they're exercising, and therefore sweat rate would go up, and you don't want to have metabolic dehydration. So there's not a fixed number, but in our research studies, we usually recommend to people to drink more water. Now, that could be an increase in fruits and vegetables, whatever vehicle they want to get, but water is just easy. And logically, if you have more water, it could allow a vehicle to get into the muscle cell a little bit quicker.
That makes a lot of sense. And that was, again, one of those questions that I got over and over and over again. Right. Any specific contraindications or safety concerns about creatine? And I got questions about hematologic issues. We just talked about the hydration and viscosity specific to factor V Leiden. So people that are prone to clotting, is there anything to support that there's a contraindication to using creatine?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. It can, we've looked at blood cell count and function in those long-term studies, especially in the postmenopausal study for 2 years, and found no adverse effects. And so in theory, I guess if the individual's dehydrated, that could cause some other abnormalities, but there's no mechanistic reason why creatine itself, it's an organic acid, would lead to blood clots. Now, it could influence blood pressure acutely if the individual is consuming too much fluid or not enough, where it will take some of the water from the blood into the cell. But all the studies and review papers I read on cardiovascular health and function, there's no adverse effects. If anything, there's potential beneficial effects. So specifically for blood clotting, thrombosis, there's nothing that I'm aware of, no.
That's certainly reassuring, because there must have been multiple people who have some hematologic issues who were concerned and wanted to know if there's any research suggestive of that.
I think, though, if they're prone to hypertension, which usually leads to potential risk for stroke and things like that, obviously medical clearance is going to be huge, because they could be on a statin or any other type of medication That doesn't normally interfere with the bioavailability of creatine or vice versa, but we always like to have medical clearance for sure when they have a pre-existing condition.
Is there any evidence that that would actually help with the improvements in body composition and specifically muscle mass? Kind of thinking about, if I'm not mistaken, I think that, if we pull more water into the muscle and we can kind of like swell those cells up. I don't know. I think the mechanism is maybe through satellite cells, but that's an opportunity maybe to stimulate more muscle growth. Do we have any evidence of that more water with creatine would stimulate more muscle growth?
Yeah, that's actually the whole premise of how creatine works. So the theory here, and this has been around since the late 1990s as well, that if you swell the cell, it sends a whole bunch of signals to turn on processes involved in protein synthesis. So you're right, it increases transcription factors, is potentially proposed to increase satellite cells. And if satellite cells migrate around the muscle fiber and donate its nucleus, it has a greater capacity for protein synthesis. It's also been proposed to increase insulin-like growth factor, maybe decrease myostatin. So there's a plethora of mechanisms that have been shown to increase with creatine or decrease. And it was primarily based on this cell swelling. If you put water into the cell, it turns on. And so by hydrating the muscle, it gets larger. That might turn on the cascade of events. It doesn't directly increase muscle protein synthesis at the ribosome level, but it sort of turns on all the other things involved and kinases in the mTOR pathway. And so this cell swelling is probably the overarching idea of how this works, why people who say I'm a responder, I felt an increase in maybe body weight, they're going to respond more often than not. And it also has those anti-catabolic effects. So if you swell the cell, that might help explain a decrease in protein catabolism or the anti-inflammatory effects. So you're correct. It's kind of the area of what was proposed is when the cell is swollen, these genes are expressed from DNA to RNA to a protein. And there's a lot of things in those intermediate steps that get turned on.
Nice. No, that's great. Yeah. I've always kind of wondered if there was because I think every time you read with the back of a supplement, there'll be kind of the general recommendation of how much water to drink, but it seems like it's going to be whole day water intake that's probably going to matter there. Another question that I had was, we talked about things that could interfere with creatine its effectiveness. Is there anything that can potentiate it? And, maybe kind of two questions with that. One, we talked about like essential amino acids. One of the things that I always wonder is whenever we isolate something that comes from a whole food, are we missing out on any benefit of what would have been being consumed with it in its whole food form? So maybe in the terms of what you could get naturally in a food, is there anything that potentiates it? And then aside from that, is there any other ingredients that you could take, whether it's something you'd find in a pre-workout or something you could take alongside of it that would potentiate it?
Yeah, it's an excellent two-part question. Let's start with the individual ingredients because it's pretty clear. So there's two things that really seem to augment or increase some of the effectiveness of creatine, at least getting into the muscle. Let's focus on muscle. One by far is insulin or carbohydrates. So I know that's a faux pas for pretty much anybody on the planet. When you say carbohydrates, we immediately think of sugar. And I say, well, wait, what about fruits and vegetables and other things that we don't really classify? But high glycemic carbohydrates, simple sugars will spike insulin. And that has been shown time after time to increase the amount of creatine getting into the cell. The downfall is a lot of the high glycemic carbohydrates are really unhealthy, or the amount you would need to consume is considered super physiological. I would probably recommend from a consistency, maybe you put a little bit in each meal, or you could take it as a bolus, but that might cause a little bit of GI tract irritation. I've taken 10 grams, 15 grams, one shot, no problem with me. Other people say, oh, I'm kind of sensitive. I think the lowest, I wouldn't go any lower than 1 gram. I think the lowest amount may be 2 to 3 grams for multiple servings. If that's not feasible for you, 2 5-gram dosages or whichever. But if you say, you know what, I'm just going to take 3 grams, I'll get muscle benefits. Hopefully that translates potentially into bone. I'm like, that's fantastic. You're going to get some benefits. And if you take it for 10 years, my guess is more muscle pulling on the bone. That's probably going to cause an increase in bone maintenance, at least for some populations. So the nice thing is you can split up creatine however you like, but whatever's convenient and maybe consistent for you is ideal. I have to take mine with breakfast and then I drink it. So I'll put it in a water bottle and I drink it during my sets. Because that's a very easy way for me to get it into the body. That's when I take it. Others might break it up throughout the day. It's really up to them. Yeah.
Well, and I think you really bring up a good point. It's, whatever is feasible, there's not this kind of strict mindset around this, for many, whether it's medications or certain types of, lifestyle measures, it has to be very strict. And from what I'm hearing, it's do the types of exercise you can fit into your lifestyle, take creatine when you can remember to take it, make sure your nutrition is on point. I think that's all very important.
Right.
Now, just a quick question about strength training. A couple questions came in about low-level home resistance band workouts. Do those count as strength training, or is that not strenuous enough to get the benefits?
Those people probably broke into my office because we're the first to look at a series of studies upcoming. I have two actually PhD students. This will be their dissertation. Because during COVID, the government said stay home and everybody was scared, and the numbers here in Canada are going back up. I'm not sure what's going on in the US, but we're like, oh God, not again. And then all of a sudden people said I had to be a shut in. I was watching a lot of TV and I had nowhere to exercise. And the detrimental effects of inactivity is catastrophic with and without protein, with resistance band training. I use resistance bands after every single set. So I perform dumbbells or machines, and then I finish the set with resistance bands, which give a great pump. It kind of mimics this low load, high volume training that causes transient hypertrophy. We're looking at that on bone as well. Could the increase in blood flow cause bone to grow potentially in postmenopausal females? So I don't know who asked that, but they probably broke in and stole some documents. But those are planned actually for the new year. We're going to look at creatine with people at home working out in the comfort of their own home. And that brings in shut-ins, people in long-term care facilities, retirees, which is a huge population that we never get access to. And we give them the TheraBands, we give them the supplement, we do Zoom monitoring, and it's a good way to encourage them in the safety of their own home. But resistance bands are really great for traveling. I take them everywhere I go. Sometimes the gym is not the best. You can do it in your hotel room or whatever, and they're space efficient. And I swear by these. And I've broken one. I think I was pulling on a sharp object, but you can do some pretty cool exercises with these in addition to exercise like dumbbells and barbells. Or you're like, hey, I don't have time to work out today. And I'm like, yes, you do. I just need 3 minutes of your time. And you can do some pretty effective exercise to at least maintain circulation and some of the benefits. Yeah.
Very reassuring. And I think for the individual, it was Caitlin who actually asked that question. Bravo to Caitlin.
Okay, I'll check to see if there's a Caitlin outside or something. That's funny. Good question. Really good. Yeah.
Next is kind of focused on, my niche, perimenopause and menopause. And so lots of questions again about bone health. This is from Susan. She said, I have osteoporosis. I'm doing all the right things, strength training, heavy walking, good nutrition, bioidenticals, calcium. I want to avoid biphosphates. Can creatine help with bone health? I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Has there been any research comparing creatine to some of the, pharmaceutical agents or,
No, there hasn't. We had some individuals with low bone mass in our long-term study, but to be diagnosed with osteoporosis or, God forbid, severe osteoporosis and frailty, we did not. And that's kind of where we're hoping to go next in some of these institutionalized individuals. It was shown to preserve the skeleton in what we consider healthy postmenopausal females. We don't know the effect it would have on osteoporotic females. Our hope is maybe it would have some, if it does, great beneficial effect. It won't compare to a bisphosphonate or any pharmacological intervention. So although creatine preserves some measures in the skeleton, bisphosphonates are a pharmacological intervention. Please don't stop taking those. They're medically prescribed. Creatine might just be a small adjunct to exercise.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing, and whether or not listeners know this, that there's some potentially really severe side effects from taking those drugs. They don't actually produce strong bone, and the mandibular necrosis is the thing that so many of us as clinicians are genuinely concerned about it. But again, Don't stop any medications. Talk to your healthcare practitioner about that.
Yeah. We're certainly not making any suggestion to stop any medication from a medical, because we don't know what other conditions they might have. Osteosarcopenia, diabetes, high blood pressure. So for those watching, if a doctor's prescribed you something, please take it, but maybe you might ask them about proper nutrition or exercise or sleep, things like that can help. Bone-related diseases such as osteopenia or osteoporosis, and then, God forbid, frailty and fracture later on. And we've done a series of studies, and some colleagues in Brazil have done a series of studies as well. And it's very clear with the minimal amount of research, I should preface that, creatine without exercise probably won't have any beneficial effects on the skeleton. The skeleton really seems to respond just like muscle to mechanical stimuli, such as weightlifting or plyometrics or even running. But it seems to have some beneficial effects primarily in postmenopausal females when combined with exercise. The primary stimulus will be weight training, but we did perform a long-term study with walking. And overall, collectively, creatine seems to preserve some aspects of bone mineral or bone strength around the hip region. It seems to improve lower limb below the knee bone area. And those two factors could have huge implications for offsetting the risk of fracture later on in life, or withstanding a fall. Most people are living in climates where winter is coming with icy roads. And if you were to fall, most young individuals can bounce back up. They might be embarrassed, but they didn't fracture a bone. Unfortunately, some older individuals suffer hip fracture or ankle fractures, which are very susceptible for osteoporosis. And of course, if you fracture, you are not performing activities of daily living or physical activity, and that could lead to a lot of chronic diseases. And so we can talk about some smaller research or the long-term study, which we did in a large cohort of postmenopausal females. But overall, it seems to have some extra benefit in addition to exercise.
And I think that's really encouraging because you're bringing up a very important distinction. We know that the lack of physical activity is a prognostic indicator, if you will, for metabolic health. And that's certainly a topic that we speak about with great frequency on this podcast. So understanding that it isn't just enough to take the creatine, you have to take the creatine and move your body. And I think that larger 2-year study that I was reading about was speaking about just the process of walking, like ambulation, and how important that can be in getting some of these conferred benefits. And so let's start there, and then we can talk about some of these other kind of smaller studies, because I'm sure there are people listening that are thinking, this is a great example. I can just take the creatine and I don't have to do the exercise. And that's not what we're saying. The creatine plus exercise is where you get the conferred benefit.
Yeah, it's so crucial. So I think a lot of people are always trying to look at a magical pill or powder to sort of save everything about them. And at the end of the day, nothing will replace exercise. I think we can all agree with that. So exercise is foundational. And then a nutritional supplement such as creatine, in this case, can provide some small but beneficial effects. So in summary, the study that you're talking about, we put postmenopausal females. Now, these were postmenopausal for 24 months. We wanted to totally make sure that they were really completely in the postmenopausal stage. The average age was 59 years of age, and they were healthy enough to participate in exercise. And we were really fortunate to finally publish a paper that was adequately sample sized. So a lot of the issues dealing with human nutrition research a long period of time. But we were very fortunate. We got a funding from the federal government here in Canada to look at the effects of 2 years of exercise. Now, the exercise protocol was 3 days of supervised weight training, a whole body routine, and then 6 days of walking. And the reason we did that is here in Canada, and I believe the same as in the United States, we're trying to promote physical activity specifically. So here in Canada, we're advising 150 minutes of physical activity from an aerobic type of standpoint per day, excuse me, and then at least 2 days of resistance training. So we sort of adhere to those recommendations with the study. And then we wanted to look at creatine supplementation over time. Now, the dose we gave was a little bit different than what's typically recommended. We've done some preliminary data showing that creatine had some potential and some small favorable effects in postmenopausal females at a higher dose than what's typically given with muscle. But the theory here is that as we get older and we're having natural bone loss, maybe we might need more to overcome or sort of compensate for the natural age-related reduction in bone. So typically with muscle, most people hear about 3 to 5 grams a day, and I have no issues with that from a muscle perspective. But when you look at the totality of bone research, the lowest dose that seems to be effective for postmenopausal females is at least 8 grams. So we started to see some trends, and we thought, why not give a bit more? And again, creatine is extremely safe, so giving a bit more should not cause any adverse effects. So we gave on average 11 grams a day, and this is important, creatine monohydrate, 11 grams a day for 2 straight years. So it was the longest trial in the world to combine creatine and exercise. And when we did a whole gamut of assessments, we saw that the females on creatine, they had a preservation of bone strength around the area of the hip, and they actually had some indication that the strength of the bone was stronger compared to the females that were on placebo. Now, this is an interesting fact. Even 2 years of weight training wasn't enough in this large cohort of postmenopausal females, and we actually assessed about 174 to offset the negative effects of exercise. So some people might say, why didn't you use a group that did nothing? Well, ethically and morally, I would hate to just say, hey, volunteer for the study, and we're not going to really do or give you any beneficial effects. So exercise was beneficial from performing some activities of daily living, but it wasn't enough or in relation to creatine to have the same effect. So at the end of the day, we concluded that 2 years of creatine and resistance training provided small, but yet very beneficial effects to the integrity of the skeleton, primarily around the hip region. And that might have huge implications for offsetting fracture later on in life. And just as important, we measured kidney and liver function to measure side effects. And for 2 years at a really high dose, there was no greater effects than placebo. And most people might be surprised by that, but realistically, when you look at all the evidence-based research, creatine essentially is a nitrogen-containing compound. It's very similar to protein. We naturally produce it in the liver and the brain. And when you consume it in foods such as red meat and seafood, it gets processed very easily. So it kind of makes sense that the body would recognize it. And if there was any excess amounts, it would simply be excreted or converted to a byproduct in the urine. So that's probably why we don't see hardly any side effects whatsoever from a liver or kidney aspect, even at high dosages. So it was a foundational study leading into the thought, now what do we do with premenopausal females? Females going through the transitional phase. And what about young females? Can we increase or strengthen the bone at the younger age? And maybe that'll offset osteoporosis later on in life. So it's sort of opened the door for a lot of potential research.
It's really exciting because I think for a lot of listeners, I was certainly part of the generation that was prescribed oral contraceptives to fix every menstrual irregularity. So at the time of my peak bone and muscle mass building years, I was kept in a low estrogen state. And not surprisingly, I'm osteopenic. I'm also a thin Caucasian female with a family history, but it makes me think about like my nieces and younger women. And, you know, could this be something people could be incorporating at a younger age to help, you know, kind of bolster their bone mass? So first question was for the menopausal women, were they on HRT? I don't know. Here in the United States, they're starting to become, you know, we're getting the second wave of, you know, coming off the Women's Health Initiative, where there was a whole generation of clinicians and patients, frankly, who was terrified about hormones, now starting to get this resurgence and understanding that HRT can be very beneficial. Were any of these study participants also on estrogen or progesterone or testosterone therapy?
And no, they weren't. And that's one of the reasons we went 24 months postmenopausal. And then they weren't allowed to be on any anti-catabolic steroids like glucocorticoids or estrogen selective receptor medication or anything that could adversely affect bone biology. So we were very specific there. We did include females who did started with low bone mass, but they were randomized equally across groups. So no, they had to be very specific because we couldn't conclude maybe it was the HRT that was influencing the bone. So we had to be very specific with the selection and inclusion criteria.
Yeah, and that certainly makes sense. And then the other question I had was, when you were looking at bone strength, were you looking at DEXA scans? Was that the standard that you were using?
Yeah, we did DEXA for segments of the whole body, and then we had some hip structural analysis we got from Johns Hopkins University to focus on the bone and actually measure the strength. And something I forgot to mention, we did measure the rate of falls and fractures over the entire study, and including 1 year after. And yes, both groups did experience falls, but there was no difference between conditions.
When I was in the latter stages of perimenopause, the first thing I noticed wasn't the loss of muscle mass. It was the loss of strength. All of a sudden, I'd be on an airplane with my typically overpacked bag trying to put it in the overhead. And I would say, oh my gosh, like it's the first time in my life I've noticed this hesitancy about picking that heavy bag up and putting it over my head. So let's talk about the progression, because I do find this interesting. It may not start with, oh, I can't seem to build muscle. It actually starts with that strength loss piece. Yeah.
So the evolution of sarcopenia has actually changed quite recently. Understanding, we used to define sarcopenia as the age-related reduction in muscle mass, strength, and functionality. But the problem with that was when we said muscle mass, most research studies would measure lean mass, and that includes water and fibrotic tissue and a little bit of lean tissue mass. The estimation is about 50%. So recent sort of research groups around the world, leading research groups, have now sort of repurposed the definition of sarcopenia to talk about first the age-related reduction in strength, as you mentioned, then and/or muscle mass and functionality. And the theory here is that the reduction in strength highly correlates with a lot of chronic diseases and functionality. And there's some new data suggesting that the lack of strength is one of the main reasons you're placed in long-term care facilities, because you can't live freely, independently later on in life. So by improving muscle strength, that is crucial. That's called Dynapenia. And one of the best ways to improve strength is obviously performing weight training or resistance style training. If you're a young, healthy individual, you don't have a lot of sleep deprivation, you feel great, creatine is probably not going to have any cognitive benefits. However, if you take a population in hypoxia, sleep deprivation, I would put jet lag up there for sure. Everybody seems to be so metabolically stressed. I think there's application for creatine to have some cognitive benefits. We see benefits from post-concussion syndrome in children. It seems that creatine can speed up some of the recovery aspects as well. And we're also seeing some potential in individuals with muscular dystrophy. The other big hot area is depression and anxiety, which is hugely prevalent. And I haven't seen the latest data from COVID, but my guess is COVID has really caused a lot of depressive and anxiety type of symptoms. And in a few studies where individuals were still on their medication, which is really important, creatine seemed to decrease some of the depressive symptoms. So collectively, there's a lot of potential, but it seems to be focused on a population base that is very metabolically stressed, or what we consider a special population. I think if you're taking creatine and you're healthy and you don't have any depressive symptoms or anxiety and you feel great, it may not have any noticeable effects. It certainly won't have any detrimental effects, and that's important. If you're thinking, will creatine hinder? We're not seeing any evidence across any study of having any negative effects. So there's a lot of potential, and we can isolate and talk about each one. I know the concussion one is a huge one.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me because especially we're kind of out of the crush of the pandemic for the last several years. Right. And, a lot of my colleagues talking about long haul COVID symptoms and any number of these things are really speaking to mitochondrial dysfunction to some degree or another. And so it makes sense that if we're taking exogenous creatine, that it could be beneficial. So you mentioned, and I know for many listeners, we got hundreds of questions about creatine. So people were very excited about our conversation. Some of the questions centered around people that have suffered concussions or, mild traumatic brain injuries, adults and children. What is the research showing in terms of dosage? And you've already alluded to the fact we need more for these brain benefits. What are the dosages that are being utilized in some of these research studies?
Yeah, so ironically, that there's only been a single study in 2 parts looking at specifically in concussion. Now, there is rodent studies that have shown that if you give a rodent creatine before they are surgically induced with concussion, you can have benefits, but obviously to a living human, you can't do that. And unfortunately, the only way we can determine this is sadly when someone does suffer TPI or a concussion, then we look at the effects of creatine versus placebo. So the only study was done in young children when they suffered a traumatic brain injury and or diagnosed with a concussion. They were immediately randomized to about 0.4 grams per kilogram. So a high dose. Again, they're a lot smaller in size of creatine or placebo. And then they sort of measure some subjective outcomes for up to about 6 months. And I believe they've actually have some data to a year. And some of the improvements that were looked at was an improvement in speech, self-care, reduction in headaches. So overall, it was sort of a subjective improvement in their ability to perform activities of daily living. They didn't really look at any brain biology markers. The theory, though, from some cellular data is that if creatine does have some potential effects, to your point, it's reducing inflammation and some improvements in the mitochondria to alleviate some of those reactive oxidative species or decrease inflammation. The other theory is maybe it increases brain creatine content to improve cellular bioenergetics. So those are the 2 proposed main family of areas. But that's all we have. The difficulty is randomizing individuals before they suffer a concussion, because ethically you're like, oh God, we don't want anybody to suffer any head trauma. But to really sort of determine this, you would have to take 2 groups of healthy individuals, randomize them before they get a concussion, and then see the effects. Most people are probably taking concussion. Most people here, in the United States, think of football players. Well, most individuals, if you're already on creatine, there's going to be a washout phase in the brain. It's probably about 5 weeks, all the way up to 90 days. So there's a lot of issues, and that's probably why we don't really have a lot of data. So caution is advised, but we're not seeing any reason why an individual who are prone to head trauma would not potentially experience some benefits.
Yeah, it's interesting. We lived in the Washington, D.C. area for a very long time, and one of the local hospitals actually offered a pre-concussion evaluation. Like if your child were to get a concussion, we would have an established baseline. And because at that time my kids were playing, flag football and lacrosse, we got baseline. Thankfully, never needed to use that information. But many, many of my friends whose kids were playing soccer and tackle football, and lacrosse for that matter, that their kids had multiple concussions before the age of 12. And it's my understanding from my own reading that that's a significant, metric, that if you have multiple concussions before the age of 12, when the brain is still growing, it's much more significant than, God forbid, either you or I or an adult listener falls and has a concussion.
Right. Yeah. And the other big issue here is the dosage. So I have a presentation coming up in October trying to look at the 3 main tissues, muscle, bone, and brain. And does each tissue determine a different dosage, which would be impossible to do from a practicality standpoint. But when you look at the series of studies, the majority have used 20 grams a day, and that seems to be a dose that has the most validity behind its effectiveness. So if we backtrack from muscle, maybe 3 to 5 grams is a very viable source. From a bone directly, we're seeing 8 to 11. And now the brain probably requires more. So people say, well, geez, what if I want to take it for everything? I personally take about 10 grams a day. But if someone says, I don't care about my brain or bone, 3 to 5 grams is plenty. That will saturate the muscle. But then if you get into someone might wanting a little bit more, so we need to do a lot more dosing studies, especially in the brain. And then regions of the brain are definitely influenced by different traumatic events. So that's another area. So I think the brain would probably be the focal point, probably for the next few decades, trying to pinpoint, does creatine work across a variety of populations? And if it does, which metabolic conditions does it really work? Which doesn't it? Does exercise need to be involved? We're starting to see the neck up. You can get cognitive benefits in a lot of these studies without exercise. But one would argue, well, geez, an increase in brain blood flow, exercise, you get all the endorphins, dopamine. Can that be a synergistic effect? So there's a lot more clinical research with large populations is desperately needed. These studies that have looked at brain function have a really, really low sample size. So we need to have a lot more research with long-term studies before we can totally say creatine is going to offset depression and Parkinson's. Again, we need a lot more research. So a caution is advised, but there's a lot of potential.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And just to kind of loop in the sleep deprivation / jet lag piece, because I think for many people listening, we're all human beings. We went to a concert last night. We didn't get home till 2:00 in the morning. I'm working on about 5 hours worth of sleep. Yes. You better believe I was bumping up my creatine dosing. Yeah. So, based on your experiences, when people are traveling, are you suggesting that they utilize creatine to help with traveling to an alternate destination and traveling home, so that they're using it throughout their vacation or their trip to help bolster some of the net impact of that time change on our circadian biology?
Yeah, that's a really good strategy. And I would even sort of back it up. So most individuals know, hey, I have a very mentally stressful job, and that occurs all year round, or I'm typically stressed or sleep deprived. So since creatine accumulates, and again, accumulates very slowly, it's unlike caffeine, my suggestion is to do this on a daily basis. That way, even on your non-exercise days, please consider taking creatine, because that will help accumulate in these demanding tissues. And during times of short-term episodic acute metabolic stress, jet lag, whatever it is, that's when it can really help. A few of the studies that have looked specifically at sleep deprivation seem to have some of the best results. So that has some promise there as well. But university students, academics, pretty much everybody I talk to are sleep deprived. I rarely come across someone who says, geez, I feel great. I always get enough sleep. You're right. I sleep sometimes 3 times a night. I'm waking up all the time and preparing for class or whatever it is. You need to have a lot of mental ability. So I think a safe strategy is to probably take creatine on a daily basis, so that it does accumulate and it's already there, present when times of metabolic stress.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And inevitably, because we got hundreds of questions, the number one question that we received, which will not be surprising to you, is, what do I deal with bloating from creatine? So some people appear to be more water retention sensitive to creatine, irrespective of dose. And so how do you kind of encourage people to either work through that? Because I always believe, if someone tells me I use creatine and I gain 5 pounds of water weight, especially if this is someone who weighs themselves every single day and is very mentally sensitive to that water weight, what are some of the tips? Or is there, or do people have different propensities physiologically? Are certain people more prone to water retention with creatine monohydrate than others?
Yeah, it's probably one of the main reasons people are deterred from taking creatine supplementation. So our skeletal muscles only has a small area for creatine uptake. And when creatine enters your muscle, it's linked with sodium, so it will drag water in. So some people say, hey, my muscles appear a little bit larger or fuller, but the vast majority will cause water fluctuations, if you will, to the body. So some people say they feel a net increase in bloating during the initial phases of creatine supplementation. That is very common. It does subside usually after about a week or so. At the end of the day, most people say, I didn't really gain much weight if you take creatine for a long period of time. So the strategy we typically use is multi-point. One, for those who are susceptible to bloating, please do not do the loading phase. So the loading phase is recommended typically for athletes or for those who really need a quick, rapid accumulation. So the loading phase is 20 grams of creatine a day, and that's usually taken in 4 or 5 gram dosages throughout the day. We're only synthesizing about 2 grams of creatine a day, and we may only get about 1 to 2 grams through our diet. So that's taken in quite a heavy amount or an extra amount. So the loading phase is notorious for causing that rapid bloat or water retention during the first week. So I would eliminate that totally, because you don't need it. what has been shown is as little as 3 grams a day. So that's probably a half a teaspoon. Taken every day will saturate your muscles in about 30 days. And you can take that dose up to about 5 grams a day to maintain that thereafter. So obviously taking a lot smaller dose will result in a lot less bloat and or water retention. I would even recommend to take that dose mixed with food. That helps with some of the absorption or some of the effects. So that's the first thing I say. Don't do the loading phase. Start with a very low dose. And we usually say 3 grams a day is probably the lowest amount. You probably could even divide that into 2 1.5 gram dosages or 3 1 gram dosages. Now, there's a little bit of caution with the 1 gram. A study in 1992 showed that 1 gram really had a minimal increase in blood creatine. You kind of need a bit more. So I think if you're okay with that half a teaspoon, mix it in yogurt or cereal or whatever you want, that's probably going to increase its ability to be taken into the body. Don't mix it with a bunch of sugar. You don't need it. And you can drink it with water or with food. And I think that would help alleviate a lot of the symptoms of bloating or net water retention. Now, if you want to get up to those greater dosages we've talked about, you're sort of say, what do we do now? We've talked about muscle, bone, and brain. Well, I would suggest to stay with the 3 gram dose and maybe take that in 3 dosages throughout the day, or maybe 4 2 gram dosages, breakfast, lunch, dinner, late in the afternoon, post-workout. So repeated smaller dosages from an absorption and retention perspective seem to be a bit more logical than taking a 20 gram dose all at once or a 10 gram dose. So I like to take my 10 gram dose in 2 5 gram dosages, and I change that up all the time. I had 5 grams this morning. I sometimes like to put 5 grams in a water bottle and drink that during my workout. It doesn't matter when you take it, it accumulates. So unlike caffeine, which is pre-exercise, you can take creatine whenever you want. Before your workout, during, wake up in the middle of the night, it really doesn't matter. The timing doesn't really seem to be that important.
Okay. And this ties into another very popular question was, when should I take it for it to be most efficacious? And it sounds like the answer is whenever you can remember to take it. It's not that you have to consume it pre-workout, intra-workout, or post-workout. It's really, when can you remember to take it consistently?
It's like, what's the best exercise to do? The answer is the one you're going to do. And then when is the best time to take creatine? There is no really best time. However, and this is important, a seminal study showed that muscle contractions seem to turn on transport kinetics of creatine into the muscle. So the theory here is if I take creatine before I exercise or right after, maybe those transport kinetics, or think of this as doorways into the cell, are sort of turned on. That could allow creatine into the muscle quicker. So prior muscle contractions seem to have a stimulating effect on creatine uptake. So one area, if someone is very focused on this, I think pre or post exercise would be a very logical and viable strategy.
And is there any interrelationship? Does it have to be consumed with cold beverages, hot beverages? Because the question always comes up, does the creatine somehow get denatured if it's exposed to heat? I mean, I sometimes I get these questions and I'm like, I don't even know how to begin answering this. So having you on board is very helpful. Right. I'm like, I'm going to ask the expert.
So an increase in temperature will increase some of the solubility. A lot of people say, hey, I mix my creatine, it's kind of gritty at the bottom of the glass. If you slightly, not a lot, slightly warm the temperature, that seems to increase the solubility. But it doesn't influence the bioavailability or the amount coming in the blood that actually gets to the cell to do something purposeful. So some people will put creatine in cold water if they don't want to consume it immediately. A decrease in temperature will preserve the integrity of the molecule, or they'll slightly increase the temperature. The only thing I would recommend not doing, and this is based on some mechanistic data and some small scale studies, is to mix it directly with caffeine. So there's some cellular data that suggests that caffeine and creatine oppose one another. So mixing it directly in coffee may not be advised for the long term.
That's really interesting because there's someone in particular who asked the question who likes to put the creatine in their coffee. And so they in particular will really appreciate that response. So when we're looking at and this is a very specific, you may or may not have any familiarity with hypermobility or, EDS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, connective tissue disorders. Is there anything suggestive that individuals that are hypermobile, that they have differing needs for creatine utilization? My guess is no, but having said that, I was like, this is such a kind of nuanced question.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of data, especially around the connective tissue area or collagen. There has been a few studies looking at creatine prior to and post ACL surgery, and it didn't really have much benefit. The thought is, could you take creatine and collagen together? Could that have some anti-resorptive effects to the bone? And that's something we're considering. But to my knowledge, I'm not familiar with any of those specificities with specific diseases.
Yeah, unbelievably, that question came up again multiple times. I'm just trying to hit the ones that came up with some regularity. How about safety in teens? For full disclosure, my teenagers both take it. They're also, one's 6 feet tall, one's 5'10". They love taking creatine, but I didn't read anything suggestive that it's harmful.
Right.
But of course, there were lots of moms asking. My kids are asking if they can take creatine safely.
It's a hugely popular and very important question. A lot of individuals are considering it. So remember, you can get about 1 to 2 grams of creatine naturally through the day through red meat or seafood. So if your child is already ingesting that on a daily basis, they're getting some amount of creatine. However, as it stands right now, the subjective safety of creatine, from GI tract irritation to headaches to nausea, is non-existent. In other words, if a child is probably taking creatine at recommended lower dosages compared to placebo, creatine is not causing any subjective adverse events. However, 2 colleagues of mine in the United States, Chad Kursick and Ajim Yagam, are now looking at some blood biomarkers finally in children to see, does this have the same safety profile as we do in adults and older adults? So that data is coming out. So right now, the totality of evidence suggests that creatine at recommended dosages, and I think 3 to 5 grams is a great, safe way to look at. Don't look at the loading phase or even higher amounts. So a 3 or 5 gram dosage is a really easy way to start. You can take higher, but that's an easy way to look at it from a safety profile. As it stands right now, it's completely safe, but we still need that blood biomarker data there. So a little bit of caution is still advised, but again, it's very similar to consuming protein. Seafood or red meat, it comes in, it kind of resembles the same metabolic pathway. So taking small recommended dosages, in my opinion, and based on what's currently provided from research, is very safe and viable.
Yeah. Any research on pregnancy and breastfeeding? Because this always comes up. I think it's from many years of working, in cardiology and ER medicine. And we were always like, pregnant and breastfeeding women, we just always say no because we don't know. Right. But is there any research that shows efficacy or safety in terms of those populations?
Yeah, there's small amounts, even less than what's in children. And Stacey Ellery is the leading researcher from out of Australia looking at this. And she's looked at some really interesting animal data and correlated that to sort of the healthy human female during pregnancy. And there's potential to improve not only embryonic development, but some health measures in the pregnant female as well. But strongly caution any female out there, please go talk to your medical practitioner to make sure it's safe and viable for you. We need a lot more research in this area, especially with long-term sample sizes. So as it stands right now, it appears a viable and a safe intervention, but a lot of caution. And again, you need medical clearance before we move forward with that.
Yeah, I think it's always safe to always say with an abundance of caution when you're trying to grow a human or conceive a human, for sure. Let's kind of round things out talking a bit about fat loss and resistance training and how, creatine monohydrate can kind of fit into that picture. So
a lot of exercising individuals are a little worried about creatine because not only did they think it increased body mass, but they felt bigger. So they sort of thought, I increased fat mass. And we published a paper a few years ago looking at the effects of creatine and resistance training on measures of body fat in adults 50 and above. And when you combine the two, creatine actually reduced body fat percentage by a very, very small amount. In other words, it did not increase fat mass. And we actually submitted a paper yesterday looking at adults 49 and lower, and we saw the exact same results, that the combination of creatine and resistance training reduced body fat percentage by a very small amount, about 1%, which is probably clinically or practically insignificant. But the cool thing is we didn't see an increase. So when people are hesitant, we're not seeing any experimental data showing that creatine increases fat mass. At the best, we say there's no effect, or you may experience a very, very small beneficial effect. But overall, it seems to have a positive effect somewhere. We probably think the increase in muscle mass is driving energy expenditure, which might help burn a little bit of calories from fat.
Yeah, it's really interesting that there are persistent themes in our conversation. A lot of it is strength training is important, protein is important, making sure you're strategically utilizing ergogenic aids or supplements if you are using them within your continuum. Is there anything that we didn't touch on today with regard to recent or relevant research that you think would be applicable for, the everyday wellness community? I tried to be really, targeted about our conversation to be respectful of your time. And I'm not exaggerating. I could probably do 2 or 3 AMAs just about with all the creatine questions that I received, which is a testament to the interest people have in the supplement.
I think the other area that gets no press is the aerobically trained or cardiovascular trained individuals, the runners, Ironman, triathlon, cyclists. Creatine was designed to improve what they call anaerobic energy, so really intense weightlifting, multiple sprints. But there's a lot of interesting data coming out now. It has a lot of benefits from recovery and or some performance benefits for soccer and swimming and sports like that. And the other big thing is they started to look at some proteins that are indications of inflammation. I think a lot of people take Advil or Tylenol for inflammation, but creatine seemed to reduce inflammatory markers post long duration aerobic exercise, such as triathlon or Ironman. So if you're training for a marathon or you love long distance aerobic exercise and you typically suffer inflammation or soreness, taking creatine beforehand seemed to reduce these things called cytokines or markers of inflammation. So we got to give a little bit of love to the aerobically trained individuals out there that I think creatine can have some application for recovery and maybe the potential for some performance in certain types of sports of intermittent activity. I think soccer and swimming come to mind there.
Yeah. Did you see more differences between genders? Because I think one of the things I was reading was that it seemed like it was more anti-inflammatory for men versus women, which I know women were a little more complicated with menstrual cycles, et cetera. But anything that you were seeing that was specific, like gender slanted in terms of what the research was showing?
That's a great question. So from an anti-inflammatory perspective, there wasn't any gender differences across spectrums. However, from an anti-muscle catabolic perspective. So what I mean by this is most people are familiar with protein synthesis, the main pathway that helps get bigger, stronger muscles. But just as important is reducing protein breakdown from a long-term perspective. So we've done a study, and a good colleague of mine at McMaster University have done a study looking at indicators of muscle protein breakdown. And for some reason, males had a reduction in protein breakdown compared to no effect or a slight reduction in females. We have no clue why that is. The only logical theory, both population groups were premenopausal, so maybe estrogen had some effect. But at the end of the day, maybe males have more of an anti-catabolic effect. In other words, they might recover from a weight training session a little bit quicker than females. Is the recovery rate that different? I highly doubt it. Males and females respond exceptionally well to creatine and exercise. But there is a few studies to show that muscle protein breakdown was reduced in males compared to females on creatine. But that's certainly an area for more discovery.
This is a question from Liz. I've been taking your brand of creatine for a few weeks now. I'm a recovered vegan, was vegan for 12 years. I strength train 3 to 4 days a week and fast on average 16 to 20 hours a day. I'm 52. When is the best time to take creatine, and does it break a fast? I've done 2 podcasts on creatine. We will make sure we link the creatine podcast so that you'll have them as a resource with this podcast. Typically, you want to take it in a feeding window. Depending on who you talk to, some people feel like you need to take it immediately after exercise. I think it just, if you're intermittent fasting, the most important thing you can do is make sure you're getting enough protein in a very tight feeding window. If you have a 4-hour or 6-hour feeding window, I always get concerned that you're not going to be eating enough protein. So creatine in your feeding window is absolutely fine. Is it true that it can cause some bloating and weight gain? I think this is very bio-individual. I'll be honest with you. We occasionally will field questions or concerns from people that'll say, oh, I think I'm gaining water weight. And then when they stop, they lose the water weight. But creatine monohydrate, you hear that word hydrate, it's hydrating those muscles. So what it is water weight gain. Some people do need to divide their doses. I think a lot of it really just depends on the individual. But I've found for me, it has allowed me to not only lift heavier in the gym, which I think is important, but it has also helped with sleep architecture. And the days that I remember to take creatine, I try every day, but some days I don't. I always sleep better. So it definitely helps with sleep architecture. And we know that creatine also has other net impact. There's a podcast with Dr. Darren Kanda that will be out later this week, which again will precede this podcast coming out. And he talks about the research on brain stress, traumatic brain injuries, jet lag, sleep deprivation, bone health. I mean, these are other research that's coming out that's showing that creatine is one of the safest, most efficacious supplements that's out there. And I think you don't know until you try the product. So that would be my best recommendation, is just, kind of see how you feel with it. For me, my entire family takes creatine, my teenagers, my husband. And what's interesting is Dr. Kandau talks about one particular research that was done. It was a randomized controlled trial of menopausal women not on HRT. So they were within the first 2 years of menopause without HRT, so that they could have a real sense of like where their bone health was. And for 2 years, the control side took creatine every day and exercised. And what's interesting is none of them had with 10 grams a day of creatine. So my creatine, the current dose is 3 grams. We recommend 5 grams for people that are vegetarian, vegan, or men. So for women, 3 grams is the minimum. These women were taking 10 grams a day for 2 years with no issues related to liver or kidney renal function. And so when people express concerns about hydration with creatine or, potentially having health issues, the research doesn't support that. So please don't let that be a concern. But I would say creatine in the feeding window is always what we're aiming for. Next question's from Rena. Can your creatine denature when added to hot food like soup, stew, or curry? It's interesting. I've asked this question of a couple people. Now, Darren Kandau, who's the researcher, doesn't love creatine in hot food. He does feel like it has the potential to impact the efficacy of the creatine. He said that it's not as if it would blunt all of it, but he prefers that it's in either room temperature or cold water. So that's just a thought. Your other question is creatine beneficial at any time, not just being centered on workouts and strength training? Yes. And definitely reference that podcast that I did with Dr. Kandau, which will be out on October 4th, which again will precede this coming out. This will be out in October. Next question is from Karen. I take your creatine, but many sources seem to caution about hydration when taking it. I work out, but not every day. Should this only be taken on workout days? Karen, as I mentioned, I have just interviewed Darren, and Darren was based on all the research, and this is his area of expertise. There's nothing to suggest that creatine is at all potentially damaging to liver or kidney function at all. I think that taking it daily is probably the best way to take it, even though sometimes, probably 5 days out of 7, I take it. A lot of it has to do with how busy my morning is, just for full transparency. But I do think that there's value in taking it daily. And what's interesting is when I spoke with Darren, he mentioned that if you take creatine and you don't exercise, like let's say you're a couch potato, but you take creatine for the benefits, you don't get the benefits. Like you actually need to be exercising with some consistency to get the most benefits out of creatine. That doesn't mean that if you take a day off that you shouldn't take it. But if you are sedentary for 6 months and you think taking creatine is going to offset that, that's not going to actually happen. So just kind of keep that in mind. But I want to end our conversation talking about a supplement that I know we both embrace and really are huge proponents of. Let's talk about creatine monohydrate, which admittedly I've been using for the last year. And I always say that if, as a middle-aged person, if I can be making gains in the gym week to week, that says a lot. A great deal of it's, the sleep and the nutrition, but I do fervently believe that creatine has really been instrumental. And I know you talk about this quite a bit in your research and your newsletters that go out. But when did you start working with creatine or got interested in creatine as an adjunct to brain health?
This was probably around 18 months ago. Maybe 2 years to 18 months ago, because I wanted to understand, how can I help post-stroke patients? Sorry. Your editor's going to hate us.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
So I started to get into creatine monohydrate around 18 months ago, mainly because I was working with a lot of stroke patients, and I wanted to understand, how can we help speed up the recovery of these stroke patients? And I saw, I also had a Parkinson's disease patient, and I saw a lot of literature around the benefits of creatine on Parkinson's disease. And I went down this rabbit hole, and that's when I was really putting out content saying that, hey guys, creatine isn't just for the neck down, which is the body, and for physical performance, it's also for brain performance. Because you think about, why are we having it? We're having it for increased ATP production, correct? Which helps with the energy that is produced in the cell, so we can push harder at the gym from a bodybuilding perspective, so we can push harder and heavier for longer, which means we'll get bigger and grow more muscle. The brain is the same. We need, and as we get older, we have a lower affinity to produce ATP. And obviously with creatine is obviously naturally occurring already. We have it, but it gets decreased as we get older, or if we've had a TBI. So I'm huge in creatine. I'm huge about putting it out there for women, because there's this myth around I'm going to get big and bulky, and rightfully, when it pushes more water into the actual cell, you can feel bulkier, yes, but we can monitor that. Maybe have 3 grams a day instead of 5. Maybe cycle it, maybe have 5 grams a day for 7 days, and then come down to 2 grams a day. Either way, it's having an effect. And this is having an effect across the lifespan. I've started to give my parents it, although at the start they thought I was giving them drugs, but we learned what it was at home. We did some education. So it helps the brains of elderly individuals, especially post-stroke patients. It helps with staving off neurodegenerative diseases. It's been widely implicated in diseases like Parkinson's disease. And I have to tell you, everyone should be taking it. They are the two best things you can take, in my opinion, is creatine and omega-3 fatty acids.
I love that. And it's interesting because there's even gender variables that are at play with creatine monohydrate, in terms of our needs depending where we are in our menstrual cycle, whether it's the follicular phase or luteal phase, and then the needs of women heading into perimenopause and menopause, when muscle protein synthesis is not working as effectively with this loss of estrogen signaling.
I'm a big fan of supplementation from like quality supplements, just because the soils are so depleted and we're just not getting enough quality vitamins and minerals from the food we eat, even if we're eating organic, like I tend to do. But the way I see supplements is as a rotation. I like to rotate supplements. I think everything in nature is cyclical. I mean, you talk about women's menstrual cycle, it's cyclical. I mean, we have different seasons. So with supplements, same thing, especially supplements with herbs and mushrooms, your body could develop a tolerance to it and you start losing the benefits. So I'm a big fan of supplement rotation in general. So the ones that I definitely use more than others would be a magnesium, whether it's like a upgraded formulas nano or a magnesium blend, but a magnesium, because we're just so depleted in that. The magnesium is a go-to. I also love Zach Bush's. Actually, I always have it on my desk. I sip it throughout the day. Ion is something that I drink throughout the day. It just helps with your tight junctions.
What is it?
And then it depends. If I'm traveling, I'll take some like immune support, like a vitamin D complex and some quercetin, liposomal quercetin, etc. What else is a go-to for me? Now it's creatine. You've inspired me to stay consistent with creatine, so I'll be on that. And I think those are the ones that are like my go-tos on a consistent basis. I'll rotate things like vitamin E and other sources, antioxidants, etc. But those are like my staples: the magnesium, the ion, and now it's going to be the creatine. What about you, Cynthia?
To be honest with you, I rotate too. In fact, my family, I'm like, don't ever touch the supplement cabinet because I have it
Specific order.
strategically aligned. And ironically enough, my functional medicine doc likes me to stop everything before I come to see him. And I always remind him, I will stop everything but my sleep support. So
Yes.
me, definitely magnesium. I use adaptogens as needed. So whether or not it's ashwagandha, rhodiola, relora, depending on what my stress is like. Definitely for me, it's the sleep piece. So myo-inositol, without question, GABA, L-theanine, those are typical, and some melatonin, because I'm of that age and it really makes a big difference. So for me, those are kind of the non-negotiables, and everything else, like, especially when I travel, I might add in some binders. I might add in, same with you, some immune support. There's a product by Designs for Health that's literally like 6 supplements in a little bag. And so I just take those with me when I travel. But more often than not, I try to think about less is more. Like, I never want to be on too much. Like, occasionally I'll take a probiotic, but I don't do that consistently because I try to get it from my food. And I do think that's important. And the other piece I would say is that there's a degree of supplement fatigue that I think everyone can experience. So if you're feeling like you're overwhelmed, that's a good sign that you need to, like, definitely pare down and simplify things, because no one wants to be on 40 supplements. Like, I've had points in my life when I've been on that many, and it's like a second job trying to figure out what I need to be taking. And God forbid I leave my house because I have to have all these supplement containers, and I'm fine doing that on the short term, but I don't want to be going to a state of craziness every time I travel.
Yeah, well said. It is like a second job with a time commitment, and then you might need a second job because of the money to
Exactly.
take all those on a daily
It gets
basis.
really expensive. So what I always say is buy the best quality you can afford and try to keep it simple. Like, trying to find a simplified regimen, I think, makes a big difference.
Yeah, in general, like Sundays are a day where I take no supplements, I drink no coffee. It's like a day to just like not have any of that. So I think it's a good protocol to have that in place.
What I'm hoping will happen is that we will begin to have access to something called a D3 creatine. D3 creatine is the way of the future, and it's a way to directly measure skeletal muscle mass. This, my friend, is going to change the way in which we actually think about the importance of skeletal muscle. Here is why. There is this longstanding belief that it is only strength that matters and not the amount of skeletal muscle mass. You'll hear this all the time. It doesn't really matter as long as you are not cachectic, or your appendicular lean mass is not 2 standard deviations below what would be considered average. The reality is we have not been directly measuring skeletal muscle mass. All the information out there is not based on direct measures of skeletal muscle mass. How can we make these statements about skeletal muscle without looking directly at the tissue? This is a problem. This is a problem because we have based decades of research on a modality that is not a direct measurement. Therefore, we've come to largely what I would consider inappropriate conclusions with this idea that it is all about strength because there, quote, isn't a correlation between mass. But the reason that there isn't a correlation between mass is because we haven't been directly measuring it. And there's a great paper I recommend you read, I recommend everybody read. And there's a D3 creatine paper. Let me see if I can pull it up, with William Evans. Is just really done a fantastic job at distilling down the importance of what has happened and the importance that actual skeletal muscle mass plays, and the necessity of directly measuring it. And what they're going to find is that skeletal muscle mass is indicative of strength and is indicative of these processes of aging. And we see it indirectly. I'm going to kind of paint the picture in this way. In Galveston, so the Galveston group, formerly Doug Patton-Jones's group, now Emily Lance's group, they show that with the loss of skeletal muscle mass, that there's an increase in insulin resistance. They say they see an increase in triglyceride levels. They see an increase in glucose, again, and they see an increase in insulin. This is directly related to the loss of skeletal muscle. Yet in the literature, we are still hearing that it's strength that matters, not muscle. But when you account for skeletal muscle mass directly, you see that it is the mass that is important, and the loss of skeletal muscle mass is probably more important than the gain of body fat when it comes to health outcomes.
That's really interesting. And how long or how far out do you think the D3 creatine is?
I don't know. I don't know, but it's still I spoke with him. It's probably still a couple years out, but it is going to change the face of everything. And it's simply a pill that someone takes. Creatine is tagged. It's a deuterated creatine. Creatine is found in skeletal muscle, and then they measure it in urine.
Let's talk about how you use creatine in your given patient population. What are the results that you're seeing? Why are you such a fan of it?
Well, creatine is interesting. It's probably the most well-studied supplement out there. As you know, creatine has been around for an extremely long time and is very, very, very safe. When you think about creatine, you have to think, where does it come from? Creatine comes from meat. It comes from red meat. It just, in a layman's terms, it's this amino acid stored in your muscle, it's in your brain, it's in your gut. Well, it's not actually stored in your gut. It's mostly stored in skeletal muscle. And it is, what has been found is that it's very valuable for not just skeletal muscle, for energy production in skeletal muscle, but it's also very important for brain function. And that is something that I think that we're going to start to see way more of. It's not just beneficial for a high intensity interval training, but it is going to be more and more important for cognitive maintenance. And also and I actually was thinking about this. For individuals, it's probably difficult to get a more optimal dose of creatine just from eating red meat or from eating foods. I think that is going to be challenging. And it's challenging, especially for women who are going through menopause. The reality is, if you are not training like a beast, you will probably have to reduce your calorie intake. And, women, it's been shown that women will show an increase in performance when you add creatine. Simply, it could supplement for 10 weeks, and there's evidence to support that it improves performance. There's no downside. There's absolutely no downside.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen improvement in sleep architecture, jet lag, brain cognition. Obviously there's research on traumatic brain injuries, but to me, it's one of those supplements that is safe for my teenagers take it. I've got my mother now taking it, who's in her 70s. I think it's one of those supplements that really there's the potential of benefits are really endless. Well, Dr. Lyon, I've loved our conversation. I'll definitely have to have you back, not within 3 years, but certainly sooner than that. Please let my listeners know how to get Forever Strong, how to connect with you on social media, how to connect with you about your amazing podcast. And let me be really clear. I'm very selective about which podcasts I listen to, but Dr. Lyons always brings on people that are not on my radar. They're the researchers. They're the people doing the hard science and making it translatable for the lay public, I think is a huge benefit. So thank you for all that you do.
Well, I appreciate you so much. People can order Forever Strong. You can order it off of Amazon. You can order it off of my website, drgabriellelyon.com. I am very active on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I have a great podcast. Again, as Cynthia said, I typically bring on absolute unknowns for the most part, those that have and are doing research, whether they have a university affiliation, but they typically have some kind of lab. The other guests I bring on are experts in their field in typically life, whether it is a military operator or that kind of individual. And I have a great newsletter. In fact, your book has been in the newsletter more than once.
Oh, well, thank you.
Sign up for free. I always put some kind of scientific study or a new podcast or a book that I'm reading, and we include that. We have, I did not tell you this, but we will be launching a provider program.
Oh, I love to know that.
Medicine provider program. Maybe you would even join. You could come beta test it with us, and that will be launched in January. And Yes. And also I will announce this, which I have not announced, is I have an event in Austin, January 13th and 14th, which I will be sending you an invitation to.
Oh, I will be attending. That's exciting.
So
Awesome.
there's where you can find me.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Got it.
I love creatine. And again, it's kind of funny. We didn't really plan this conversation to continually go back to my bodybuilding days, but it keeps getting pulled in. I remember back in, oh gosh, this is the late 90s now, when there was the EAS Body for Life contest, which I did, my sister did, my dad did, we all did it together as a family, these before and after pictures, and you had to use their products, right? And creatine was one of them. Well, my sister's a physician, so she wanted to do her due diligence and really look into creatine. Is it good for you? Does it have any side effects, anything? And that was the one supplement that had nothing but positive benefits associated with it. There was literally nothing she could find that correlated creatine with anything bad in the body, side effect wise, nothing. Some people back then with the type of creatine we were using would hold a little bit of water, so you get a little bit of water retention, but that's because of the mechanism of action of creatine literally shuttling nutrients into the muscle cell and providing more energy, providing more hypertrophy of that muscle tissue. So I've been a fan of it for decades now, literally decades, because I think we can honestly say it really is the one supplement that has been out for decades that has nothing tied to it in terms of negative effects, negative consequences from use. So I'm a huge fan. And I try to get my ladies to understand that, and I think it is being pulled more into the regular market, out of the bodybuilding world, out of the sports supplement world, and into the, hey, let's use it for day-to-day function, day-to-day benefits in terms of our audience. And women are slowly realizing, and especially with your education of creatine, with your audience, realizing its importance, realizing the benefits, realizing that this can produce a little bit better workout. Like, yeah, those 5 push-ups that you did that you thought that number 5 was really hard. Now you just banged out 7. And maybe 2 weeks from now, it's going to be 10. And you just went from 5 pounds to 7.5 and then to 10 pounds. So those little incremental strength changes, that's going to come back and obviously benefit. When we lift heavy, we improve our testosterone and our growth hormones naturally, or levels naturally. So the creatine gives us a little bit more strength. We're stronger in the gym because we're lifting heavy. That's going to come back and improve our testosterone levels. That's going to come back and improve our growth hormone levels. Now, what do we know about testosterone? It actually has a feedback on the thyroid, specifically with Hashimoto's, to lower Hashimoto antibodies. So all this talk about testosterone, I didn't mention that another benefit of it is to lower Hashimoto antibodies. And we see this documented in studies. Of course, they were done with men, but we see it across the board in women as well. When we optimize a woman's testosterone levels, her antibodies also go down, and just that whole inflammatory response of the body goes down, and the thyroid works better. The thyroid is going to work better when all of your other functions in your body are better, when your sex hormones are better. The thyroid's going to work better when you're not inflamed, when it's not getting beat up by those antibodies on a daily basis. It is going to work better. So yes, we can absolutely say that through that pathway, creatine is beneficial to the thyroid. And then there's just the other benefits of creatine, improving nutrient absorption. Like we said earlier, shuttling those nutrients into the muscle cell. I mean, you've talked so much about it. I need to go down some more rabbit holes of creatine because I just mainly recommend it. And I just tell people, hey, start on this. Here's the benefits. But I know that you've even dove into anti-aging benefits of creatine, brain benefits of creatine, right?
Yeah. And even mood and cognition. I mean, the thing that's been interesting. So, I think it's important to get real life testimonials. And the things that I always find amazing is people saying to me, I've had long-term depression. I'm on medication. Within 3 days of taking creatine, I feel like my mood is lifted. And I always say, don't stop anything you're doing. Talk to your doctor. Like, I'm always like, don't change anything. But I think that's wonderful. And I think it really speaks to mitochondrial health. It really speaks to ATP production. It really speaks to all of these cellular mechanisms that people can tangentially, they're like, okay, I lift better. I lift heavier in the gym. I'm sleeping better. Like it can help with sleep architecture. My mood is better. And so people focus on that, but I always say it always comes down to the same things: mitochondrial efficiency, ATP production, cellular, like getting down to the cellular level. I mean, all those things are so important. And I think in a sea of the supplement industry that in many ways I think is well intentioned. Let me just be really clear. Well intentioned, because I come from a glass half full kind of, I'm a glass half full kind of person. But I think in many ways, like if you really go down those rabbit holes and really spend time, like I know you have with your own supplement line, that things can be very, very helpful. I'm like, let's simplify things. Let's not be on 50 supplements. Let's be on a curated amount of supplements that we know are very helpful. My entire family actually takes creatine, which I think is hilarious because people will say, is it safe for teenagers? And I was like, I have two very athletic teen boys. And you would ask my 15-year-old, he took it with him to where he's at a university doing a program right now. And he took it with him. He's like, I stick it in my water and I carry around my water bottle and I get to take it. And so I love that we both have this shared appreciation for creatine monohydrate.
I will say one thing that I've seen, and I know you're on this one too. And if I was going to pick one supplement, one extra thing for a menopausal woman, peri-post, as something that you should be on for the rest of your life, it would be creatine. Like I think creatine, and I will tell you what, Cynthia, it's almost like, I feel like I've been time traveled back to the 80s when I was bringing women to Gold's Gym in Venice to lift weights, and I was taking them on field trips because they were so afraid they were going to get big. I said, I'm going to take you into the gym. You're going to see 70-year-old women whose bodies you would die to have, right? Lifting heavy weights, not big. So I feel like that when I talk about creatine, the first thing I hear from women is, oh, I hear that's going to make me gain weight. I go, well, if you gain any weight, which usually doesn't happen with women, it's going to be water in your muscles. This is a good thing. Oh, no. I'm like, wait, hello. So I feel like I'm catapulted back to that time, and women are afraid to touch it because they think it's going to make them bigger, not understanding that if it were to bring a little bit more water in your muscle, this is a great thing. You want well-hydrated muscles.
Absolutely. And I think the research around creatine is so interesting because for me, it was initially this desire to improve metabolic health, help with strength in the gym. I have my teenagers taking it. They love it. And then it evolved to understanding it helps with sleep architecture. It helps with, bone health. It can help with traumatic brain injuries. It can help
my son's
with
on it.
Exactly. It can help with, jet lag. We just got back from a trip a couple weeks ago, and right around that time, I was preparing for a podcast and literally just started doubling my dose of creatine, and it cut my jet lag in half. I usually struggle more when I go west as opposed to east. And so it's really interesting to me, unfortunately, I think creatine got a bad rap, back in the probably 1980s, 1990s, when people were abusing anabolic steroids in conjunction, we're also using creatine. So it kind of got looped in, but all the research that I have read and talked with creatine researchers, it is a very, very safe supplement. It is a supplement that has been probably more research behind it than any other ergogenic aid, which just means supplement. And so I love that you also are such a big fan.
Hey, if you like this video, you guys are going to love this video, and I'll see you there.
If you have either uncontrolled diabetes, and this goes for type 1, type 2, LADA, MODY, any form of diabetes, if you follow the standard, if you follow no advice, you're probably going to hasten your death even more than 3.5 years for each decade you have it. But if you follow the standard advice, the state-of-the-art advice, the scientific consensus advice, then yeah, you're probably going to be knocking 3.5 years off your life for every decade that you follow the American Diabetes Association recommendations.